Good morning, everyone. Welcome, and you are at Moving People Forward at the session on Designing Streets for All Abilities. I'm Jessica Vargas. I'm the Program Manager for the Denver Streets Partnership, and I'll be your moderator today. So before we start, we have a few housekeeping items. The video and audio functions are set to off for attendees, but we do encourage you to participate throughout the session through the chat function, which gives you the option to submit comments and questions to all attendees or to just the panelists. Or you can submit questions directly to the panelists via the Q&A function. And so we'll try to get to as many of the questions as we can, either in writing or during the panel session. Next slide, please. And so we'd once again like to begin the session with a land acknowledgement. At Moving People Forward, we must not only talk about the future, but acknowledge the past. Our team would like to reserve space to recognize and honor the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute nations, who were the original occupants and custodians of this land for centuries before genocide and ethnic cleansing led by white settlers. We're grateful to these communities, their living descendants in Colorado, and descendants of those forcefully relocated here, for their wisdom and resilience in both the past and present. It's critical that we keep in mind the connections between transportation and these American Indian communities. Everyone in this room travels and recreates on stolen lands, and many of us choose how we get around and the impact we have on the land. Many of us also make decisions on transportation systems and how land is used that further influence our community's footprint. And while our fields often discuss freedom of mobility, we must also acknowledge the right for people to stay in place that was taken from American Indians by colonizers. Thank you for honoring these people and their land with us. Next slide. I'd also like to take some time to thank our sponsors who made the Moving People Forward conference possible. Our presenting sponsor is Lyft. Our champion sponsors are Quality Bicycle Products, People for Bikes, and Colorado Bike Law. And AAA Colorado is the sponsor for this specific session. And finally, I would like to remind you all of the norms for our Moving People Forward conference. We ask that you be present and actively listen, generously share your thoughts, ideas, and questions in the chat, assume best intentions of each other, and challenge your own assumptions, and seek to understand new, different, or constructive perspectives. Expect and accept non-closure and lean into any discomfort, and hold yourself and each other accountable to these norms. People is arguably the most important word in our conference title, Moving People Forward. And so for each session, we have produced a video highlighting a personal story that relates to the theme of the session to underscore how the ideas that we're discussing today impact people's daily lives. And so for our session today on Designing Streets for All Abilities, we'd like to share with you the story of local disability advocate Rosemary, resident of Wheat Ridge, Colorado.
My name is Rosemary McDonnell-Horita. I am a disability rights activist here in Denver. I used to work at an organization called Atlantis Community. They are a center for independent living, so they do advocacy for people with disabilities in the Denver metro area, and I was their youth transition coordinator. But the really great thing about doing disability advocacy is it allows me a space to be able to do community work in a lot of different arenas. Navigating the city as a person with a disability is really challenging. You always have to think 2 or 3 steps ahead. So for me to get from point A to point B, I might take my car or I might take RTD, but then things don't work and lifts are broken on buses, or sometimes, scheduling is off, or I can't get to my car because there's too much snow and I can't remove all of the snow in a way that's accessible to me. Navigating sidewalks are also really challenging, whether it is too narrow or not accessible because of snow, or the dreaded flagstone walkways just make it really impossible. There's lots of different ways that navigating this city as a person with a disability can be extremely challenging. it feels really helpless when you encounter a sidewalk that has a light post smack in the middle. Like on West Colfax, for example, I've seen some folks who use wheelchairs and are trying to get on one side, from one side of the block to the other, and there's a trash can or a light post or a bench. You have to either cross Colfax or go all the way around. A lot of these city plans were not created with us in mind or even with us in conversation. So I think it reiterates how important it is for disabled people to be in the rooms or at the tables having our input heard of why it's so important to be able to, you know, cross the street safely, which seems really silly, but a lot of people can't even have that luxury right now. Thinking about curb cuts are something that people who use wheelchairs utilize, but also skateboards and those free riding scooters that we see downtown. And if you have a shopping cart or suitcases, like there's lots of different ways that people use curb cuts every day, but it was originally for wheelchair access. So if we were to go towards a more universal design approach, I think it would eliminate a lot of those conflicting access needs. It would also bring in the larger community. The thing about disability is that anyone can become disabled at any point in their life, and especially with the COVID-19 pandemic, lots of people are having lifelong symptoms and effects of the COVID-19 diagnosis. So thinking about how we can bring our community in instead of keeping them separated and isolated. There are tons of reasons to invest in universal design and disability access, not just because you're personally invested, but because we all benefit from some of the renovations that have happened since the Americans with Disabilities Act. But I think that with a universal design approach, it really is that inclusion of all people who are navigating certain spaces. And I hope that that's the direction that we're going. That's my dream, at least. It is remarkably cheaper to include disability access and universal design in the planning process rather than having to do it later as a renovation. It also makes a lot more sense to have disabled folks and advocates at the table to provide input, because we've lived in a world that was not created with us in mind. And so we're really fabulous innovators. And when you bring us to the table, you'll be surprised what you get.
We're excited to welcome our 6 panelists to the session. Panelists, please join me in turning on your cameras as I give you a quick introduction to our audience. In addition to Rosemary McDonnell-Horita, whose story we just heard, joining us today are Jody Medeiros, Executive Director of Walk San Francisco, Mike Jacobson, Planner at the Livable Streets Division of the San Francisco Municipal Transportation Agency, Jonathan Fertig, Senior Architect at Davis Partnership Architects and co-founder of local cycling advocacy group, the Denver Bicycle Lobby, and David Pulsifer, Planning Supervisor at the Denver Department of Transportation and Infrastructure, or DOTI. And helping me monitor the chat and Q&A boxes today is Jill Locantore, Executive Director of the Denver Streets Partnership. And so right now we also want to learn a bit more about you on the line with us today, since we can't be together in person. So we're going to use one of the Zoom features to do a quick poll of who's in the audience today. And that should be pulling up for you right now. And so if you could just take a minute to answer a couple questions for us. And of course, I see that everyone's introducing themselves in the chat. So it's great to see exactly who's with us. Great. So just looking here, we've got a lot of advocates on the line. That's so great to see. And lots of planners, both public and private sector, engineers, and our BC members. So it's great to have you all here. Thank you so much for joining us. And so now I'm going to hand it over to Jody and Mike to share more about their efforts in San Francisco to advance designs for protected bikeways that also work safely for people in wheelchairs, seniors who use walkers, and other people who may have challenges getting across the bike lane to the curb. So Jody and Mike, all yours.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this morning. And I'm so happy to be part of this Moving Peoples Forward conference with this esteemed panel, and excited to be here today. As Jessica said, my name is Jody Medeiros, and I'm the Executive Director of Walk San Francisco. And I'm going to be presenting our project with you, along with my colleague from the Municipal Transportation Agency, Mike Jacobson. And our goal is really to show how we in San Francisco worked to bring safe and accessible bike lanes for all users. Next slide, please. I think it's important to show who Walk San Francisco is. We've been in existence for over 20 years, and we are the only pedestrian advocacy organization to make walking enjoyable for all. And we were instrumental for the city of San Francisco to get Vision Zero. We were the second Vision Zero city in the country to end all severe and fatal crashes by 2024. And it is about bringing a lot of different people together, working with diverse partnerships, whether it be city agencies or local housing advocates. And we really want to raise voices through coordinated action, because we truly believe that San Francisco can and should be the most pedestrian friendly city in the nation. Next slide, please. And so we work in a variety of different ways. As I mentioned, we are part of instrumental to getting Vision Zero in San Francisco, and we also lead the Vision Zero Coalition. And this is the group of 35 organizations, neighborhood groups, nonprofit civic groups, and this is how we work across the community. And we are here. We also formed what we call the Senior and Disability Working Group of the Vision Zero Coalition, and that happened in 2016, 2 years after Vision Zero was passed. And I'll tell you more about that in a little bit and how we work, because it's instrumental to this project. But next slide, please. And what we're really trying to do is change this trend of people dying or being seriously injured by traffic violence. You see here that 2019 was one of our worst years since the start of Vision Zero. And sadly, in 2020, we had the same number of people die in traffic crashes, despite the reduction in vehicles in San Francisco. And we know that this is an equity issue. Next slide, please. So, those that are most impacted by our streets and our unsafe streets are seniors. And while they are only 14% of our population, they are making up annually 50% of our fatalities. And I think that it's really important to note that by 2030, we know that our seniors are going to be more than a quarter of our population. It's our largest growing population. So that's why we are strongly advocates for saying that now is the time to design our streets so that they are safe for all people of all abilities. Next slide, please. And so where did we begin? Back in 2013, the city of San Francisco brought agencies together, accessibility professionals, and Walk San Francisco and our Bicycle Coalition. And they created this guide, so guidelines for accessible building blocks for bicycle facilities, which is great. That was a great start. But after miles upon miles of separated bike lanes that were getting on the ground in San Francisco, we really realized that this wasn't enough and more needed to be done. Next slide, please. So this is where the Senior Disability Working Group really came in. Tragically, in 2016, after the death of a local disability rights advocate, the Senior Disability Working Group was formed. So we realized that we needed a special group that was really focused on senior and disability actions and looking at our streets, and so that how we could give more advice and thoughtfulness to how we are doing our design. And it's become an incredibly powerful voice. So a couple of projects that we've worked on that we've won, not only this Getting to the Curb report, but we also helped pass longer crossing times or walking times, and also getting more accessible pedestrian signals throughout San Francisco. So next slide, please. Where did we start? In April of 2017, we took a tour. So we looked at 3 currently separate bike lane projects to get a perspective and to really look at the challenges that people with disabilities and seniors were facing. And we did this in conjunction with our San Francisco Bicycle Coalition. In San Francisco, we have 2 separate groups. We have our walking groups, we have our biking organization, and we also have our transit riders. So always San Francisco, we're unique like that. Whereas Denver, you all put everybody together, but we have them separate. And so we brought our advocate groups, our partner groups together, and we did a tour. And this really just started a healthy dialogue and to really start to understand what needed to change and how we could basically make these a lot better. And we noticed that the designs that we were creating, it really was problematic for people who needed direct access to the curb. And that's mostly seniors and people with disabilities. Next slide, please. And at this tour, we're really able to document how and why the facilities weren't working and how they needed to change. And so we created this entire note packet that we shared with the SFMTA. And this is really the beginning steps of our Getting to the Curb guide. Next slide, please. Almost a year later, we had a charrette where we brought together city agencies, the Mayor's Office on Disability, all kinds of senior and disability advocates, transit riders, bicycle coalition. We brought everybody into a room to really look for perspectives, ideas, solutions. And so we thought that a healthy dialogue was going to be important to really get this going. And we didn't stop with just San Francisco. We invited our adjacent Bay Area counterparts from Oakland and Berkeley, and we brought everybody together because we need to learn together on how we could do this, and we needed a lot of different perspectives. And we held a half-day workshop, and I'll show you what we did in the workshop. So next slide, please. We outlined 5 distinct challenges. We noticed that these are the things that were happening, and so this is the things that we were going to discussing. Problems with transit islands, sidewalk level bike lanes, floating parking, whether that be loading and unloading, floating parking trying to get to the curb, and other types of different bike infrastructure that we were seeing. And we broke people into groups, and we had these, a facilitator, and we had these large posters. Everybody got one problem to work on. And from there, we, next slide, please. So we gave everybody a worksheet, and it was just, everything had to be very solutions oriented. And we were honestly looking for those aha moments that people were having. And we compiled the notes, and the next steps really led to this exploration of how we're going to bring more ideas and structured learning to the SFMTA. And next slide, please. And from there, we created the 9 principles. And I'll give you a second to read those over. These principles were included in the guide. They're in the appendix, page 23. And things seemed a little backwards. We ended up releasing these principles before the guide was done, and it was urgent and timely. So we had a really tragic bicycle fatality, and there was a strong push for more separated bike lanes to be enacted in San Francisco. And so the Senior and Disability Working Group thought that, yes, they supported this infrastructure. They wanted to see more bike lanes put on the ground, but they really wanted to make sure that this was an equity and an inclusivity issue, and they were addressing their needs as well. And so I'm going to present one of these, and my colleague Mike is going to walk you through several that we have here in San Francisco. And I think that it's really important to pause here and to say, this partnership would not be possible without our city's agency at the table and being very open to exploring this together and really applying these, not only exploration, but really application. So thanks to that city, our city's leaders for doing that. And we got to, next slide, please. Finally, the guide was printed in November of 2019. So it did take us a while. It's about a 30-page guide. Hopefully you've all seen it. And it's complete with illustrations and a glossary and examples of all the challenges that we found. I do want to express that this was a very large labor of love, and there are so many people to thank in terms of who made this happen. And I also want to express that not only do our city agencies like the SFMTA, but our Department of Public Health help funded this work. And we could not have made this guide without our other city partners who saw the importance of this and decided to fund Walk San Francisco in order to do this work. So this is a project for all of us. This is a project that we want to make sure is incredibly visionary. It looks at real life problems in a very different way. It looks at universal design, but we also don't put in it really strict design guidelines, but really concepts. So each city could go through this and see the things that they could do, that they could be doing individually, that is going to help their populations that they need to help access their streets all the time. And let's see how we can apply it to your city. Let's look at one example. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, we did look at, we ended up doing illustrations throughout the entire book. We did not do examples from around the world. We thought that it was much easier for this to be applicable to any group and city if you saw just a generic place. And right here is one that we saw, like, here's one of the challenges. How, when you have a floating parking space, do people get across to the curb? And so we produced a solution here, which was our raised crosswalk, and with the indication that bikes needed to go slower. So is this possible for all? No. But is this something that we could be looking at for all of our accessibility? Yep, it's definitely one of those things that we need to start considering as we move forward. And it does make sense to go back and to see where these easy solutions can be put in for those separated bikeways or cycle tracks that we currently have. Next slide, please. And I can't stress this enough. It's the inclusionary process for planning and the community engagement. This is the thing that made this guide really, really sing in many ways. And I think that Rosemary also hits this on her video as well. Bringing people to the table, bringing lots of different ideas to the table, going out with your senior and disability groups and doing audits and looking at the infrastructure that's in place, watching them work, watching them try to navigate. And that is the part that was the biggest, that drew the most aha moments. Next slide, please. And at that, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague at the SFMTA, our transportation agency, who's going to walk you through some actual changes that we've made in San Francisco based on this guide. So thank you.
Thank you, Jody. My name is Mike Jacobson. I'm excited to be here to co-present with Jody. I want to thank her and the Senior and Disability Work Group for being such wonderful partners as the city continues to construct protected bikeways. Our agency does our best work when we have engaged advocates at the table early in the process to share their lived experiences. For this presentation, I've selected a few of the many design considerations for implementing a street level protected bikeway. My primary focus will be on crossing the bikeway itself, but I'll also briefly discuss detectable edges for street level or raised cycle tracks. There are numerous topics we can talk about today, including other elements of sidewalk level cycle tracks, transit boarding island design, but we can save that for another day in another session. Before I get into the slides, I just want to provide a little bit of additional background on how we got here today. The agency started constructing protected bike lanes to increase comfort for the city's growing bicycle ridership. Understanding the design challenges inherent in certain bikeway designs, the agency worked with the Mayor's Office on Disability, other city agencies, and our advocates to create an early accessibility guide, the first of its kind in the nation, the one that Jody referenced earlier in her presentation. Then later on in 2019, our city's mayor called on the agency to accelerate the construction of protected bike lanes, the goal of building 20 miles over the next 2 years. This directive, coupled with our new quick build policy, made it even more critical that we increase our engagement with senior and disability advocates to make sure that all of this new infrastructure is being designed to maximize accessibility and safety for everyone. So with that context, let's go take a look at some of the major challenges the work group identified and how the agency considers them while designing. So we can take a look at the next slide. Thank you. So we use the 9 principles as our guide to just really break down 3 major design challenges as it relates to crossing the bikeway. The first one is, how do we ensure there's equitable, safe, and convenient curb and sidewalk access? The second question is, what can we add to bikeway crossings to make them more visible for pedestrians and cyclists? And last, how should we design a buffer that balances the need to limit vehicle encroachment into the bikeway and give emergency vehicle access to the curb, while also providing room for the safe movement of people with disabilities in a constrained right of way? So let's start with challenge number 1. If you want to go to the next slide, please. So our first challenge is ensuring that a senior or a person with disability can park, load, or unload from the parking lane, the floating parking lane, and access the curb and sidewalk. We generally use traffic delineators, those plastic posts that you see out there, to create that vertical separation between moving vehicular traffic and cyclists. The delineators have been shown to be effective barriers, but through experience, we have learned that how and where we place them can have serious impact on accessibility. So let's take a look on the next slide. So the picture on your left is a picture of a passenger loading zone from an earlier design. So as you can see, the vehicle is not pulling all the way into the loading area, and the pedestrian needs to squeeze through these small gaps between the delineators. The closely spaced delineators are a much larger obstacle for a person using a mobility device. It makes it difficult for paratransit vehicles to get direct access to the curb. The picture on the right shows a later design. That white curb paint you see denotes a passenger loading zone, and you can see a delineator placed at either end of the approximately 40-foot long zone. We've since placed one more delineator in the middle of that zone, creating 20-foot spacing, enough to allow easy movement from vehicle to curb, while still giving a visual indicator to motorists that they are not to pull into the bike lane. And later on in this presentation, I'll show you how we've further improved this design. We can go to the next slide. So next, how is one supposed to access the sidewalk if they park or unload in the middle of the block and use a mobility device? In a not so distant past, when I was able to travel around the country, it seemed like a standard approach would be to assume that the person would travel the length of the block in that buffer area to use an intersection curb ramp. We do not rely on that design in San Francisco. So let's take a look on the next slide. The picture on the left shows what that trip that I just described would look like. So you'll see a person exiting the vehicle, and they would be forced to either use a driveway curb cut, which may not be ADA compliant, or they would have to travel all the way to that traffic signal that you see in the back of the photo. In San Francisco, we use 2 design techniques to provide mid-block curb access where there are legal parking and loading spots. The first is building ADA compliant mid-block curb ramps at any long stretch of parking or at any passenger loading zone. Generally, ramps are spaced between 100 to 200 feet apart, depending on the parking and loading situation. And this is now our standard design for all of our quick build projects. Quick build projects, I'm referring to projects that tend to rely on paint, posts, signs to be quick and effective rather than larger, longer term streetscape projects. Our preferred design, however, is to raise the crossing from the loading zone or island to the crosswalk. This means the wheelchair user does not have to ramp down and back up to reach the sidewalk. So you can see that raised crossing, that lower right-hand picture. That's at a transit boarding island we have in the northern part of the city. Raised crossings are incorporated in our streetscape projects. They do take significantly more time to design and construct than our quick build designs. They also add complexity due to issues related to drain off and the need to install catch basins, but we still prefer to raise crossings when we can and where we can. Next slide, please. So the next topic I want to talk about is crossing the bikeway itself. So bicycles and scooters, electric or otherwise, they're relatively quiet machines. So we must make sure that all road users are aware of where people will be crossing the bikeway. The first way to ensure safe crossings is to make sure the crossing is visible. So let's take a look at the next slide. So we're gonna have a series of pictures here. And they're gonna kind of show our designs going from clearly deficient to much better, in my opinion. So picture one in the upper left-hand corner, this is a deficient design. There's no contrasting green paint. There's no ramp for pedestrians to access the sidewalk. Whereas picture two, it's a little bit better. Now we have that high contrast green paint, which screams bike lane to the user. And there is a ramp for pedestrians. If you want to go to the next slide, please. These photos show even more improvement. Number three, on the top left, we add a high visibility continental crosswalk to the intended crossing area. Picture four shows one of our accessible boarding on Valencia Street. Valencia Street is one of the busiest bike corridors in the city. The yellow continental crosswalk tells the bike rider that they're in a school zone. We've also added yield teeth and a sign to warn cyclists that people regularly cross here and they must yield to pedestrians. Since this picture has been taken, we've actually added a new stencil about 20 feet prior to the yield teeth with a stencil that reads slow pedestrians crossing. Our evaluation program has gone out and evaluated these accessible boarding island designs, and on Valencia Street at these school boarding zones, we've observed 0 close calls or near misses between cyclists and pedestrians, which speaks to the design. And then that last photo in the bottom left-hand, photo number 5, just shows how sometimes we'll use that look stencil just to give some extra indication. This is a picture of a contraflow bike lane, which can be a little bit more challenging to maneuver. If we'll go to the next slide, please. So next up, to ensure safe crossings, we need to manage the speed of bicyclists, and we use several approaches to do that. So let's take a look at the next slide, please. Our first approach is to narrow the bike lane behind boarding islands. We know pedestrians will regularly cross the bikeway at boarding islands, so a narrower lane will ensure slower, most importantly, single file riding. If you can you back up 2 slides for me, please? I think I have a better example. Perfect, thank you very much. So you can see in picture number 4, that boarding island that I mentioned earlier. So this lane is narrowed by 1 foot. And you can see that we also add the white striping on either side of the bike lane, which gives even more of a visual cue to the bike rider that the bike lane is narrowed to ensure that cyclists ride more slowly as they pass these areas and they ride single file. Appreciate it. We can bump it back up to perfect. Thank you very much. So the next, we use signs, like making sure to yield to pedestrians, all of our favorite MUTCD signs. Then picture 3, This is showing the first protected intersection that we installed in San Francisco, where you see the contrasting paint and several pavement markings to influence cyclist speed. And we have clear demarcation of where pedestrians are expected to cross. And you can see that slow pedestrian crossing decal in this photo. We can go to the next slide, please. So the last main topic I wanted to discuss today is buffer design. We design our buffers to be 5 feet or wider where we expect parking and loading. That buffer can get narrower, but a narrower buffer generally means there's either no adjacent loading or parking or destination nearby. On one of our field visits with the Senior and Disability Work Group, members that used a variety of mobility devices to test the 5-foot buffer and felt comfortable traveling along it to access a nearby curb ramp, a mid-block or intersection curb ramp. A topic that came up regularly from our advocates is that buffer width is important, but delineator placement can really make or break how well a buffer is designed. So let's take a look in the next slide here. So many of our earlier designs, we placed delineators directly in the middle of the buffer. So the picture on the left, fortunately, it's showing a relatively wide buffer where there's still some type of path of travel here, but envision that delineator placement on a 5-foot buffer. This would effectively narrow that width to 2 to 3 feet, which is clearly insufficient. The picture to the right shows our current approach. We place delineators at either end of a parking stall, so effectively 20 feet apart, and we offset those delineators to the parking side of the buffer. And this serves 2 primary purposes. It allows a wider path of travel along a more generous buffer, and it also minimizes vehicle encroachment into that buffer from vehicles that are parking or loading. So again, I want to thank the work group for their guidance and feedback on delineator placement, because they were instrumental in helping us create these designs. If we go to the next slide, please. And I wanted to briefly mention a new approach that we're piloting on a limited basis. This is using a 1-foot wide raised trapezoidal edge to represent a path of travel. We've used this treatment a total of 1 time. So when I say it's new and we're piloting it, I really mean it. So that's why I have a little star next to the trapezoidal edge to make it a point that this is a very new approach for us that we're really excited to try. So with members of the Senior and Disability Work Group, Lighthouse for the Blind, Senior and Disability Action, and several other organizations, the city partnered with a leading accessibility researcher to find a treatment to replace the use of truncated domes to be used along the path of travel. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So the picture on the left, pardon me. The picture on the left is of our Market Street raised bikeway pilot. This is from about 2016. So we installed truncated domes to clearly delineate the sidewalk and the semi-raised bikeway on a portion of the pilot area. The truncated domes were hard to clean, as you can see. But most importantly, they're confusing to low vision walkers. After testing no fewer than 8 treatments, it was found that this trapezoidal edge that you see on the right was best at separating each space while also providing clear feedback and direction for the walker. So the picture on the right showing that trapezoidal edge, this provides a clear path of travel along this dual use path. And then in the distance, you can see truncated domes that are in line with a crosswalk, just like one would expect to see at an intersection curb ramp. So we can go to the next slide, please. So in closing, I'd like to thank Bicycle Colorado, Denver Streets Partnership, and Jody for having me here today. I look forward to continuing the collaboration with Walk SF and the Vision Zero Coalition. in the Senior and Disability Work Group. And I'm also looking forward to continuing the conversation with everyone here today. And you can find my contact and Jody's contact info on the next slide. And that does it for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jody and Mike. That was a great deep dive into not just design ideas, but the process of how you arrived there. So I'd like to invite into the conversation now Rosemary and Jonathan. Jonathan is a local bike advocate, Rosemary is a local disability advocate. I'd like to hear your thoughts about what you've just heard. What did you like? Any questions you have, and how you think this can be applied here in Denver?
You want to go ahead, Rosemary?
Great, thanks, Jonathan. Good morning, everybody. My name is Rosemary. I use she, her pronouns. I had a chance to look over the guidelines, and the first thing I would say is I really love how they incorporated the disability community's perspective and actual lived experience. I think that makes a huge difference in actually getting to see what works and what doesn't, and what some best practices might be. As people with disabilities ourselves, we know what works best for us, and we can also try to come up with new solutions, even if we haven't seen them before or they haven't been created, really thinking outside of the box. And so I would really encourage not just Denver, but any city who wants to take this on to really incorporate the community's feedback. And that was the first thing that really stood out to me. Jonathan?
Yeah, I thought that the guide was incredibly impressive, and really highlights how bicycle advocacy and pedestrian advocacy, just universal design, is all interrelated, all part of the same picture, and how improving access for one improves access for all of the others. And, I think anybody who rides a bike around the city knows that the buffer design is crucial, and the design of the delineators is crucial, and that when it doesn't work, it really doesn't work. And so I think that this guide really points in a direction of how to find something that will, ensure that people driving don't encroach on the bike lane, and that people who need access to the curb have good access, and that those two things are really complementary.
Yeah, I would agree. I was really struck by, going out there and taking a walk is just crucial. It's definitely something that the Denver Streets Partnership has done in the past with members of our disability community and with our local leaders. So how do you see that playing into how we bring this to Denver a little more?
I think one question that I have from the plan and in the conversations of how involved the disability and the senior community is really thinking about who those key stakeholders are in our local area. So whether that is CCDC, the Colorado Cross Disability Coalition, or Atlantis community, or thinking about different schools or way that you can access sidewalks and cars and bikes all in the same place. When we get into a world where we can be outside of our homes and we're not working from home exclusively, but I would really love to have a conversation about who those are, and also knowing that not everyone who uses those features might identify as disabled, and so they might not opt into these specific communities, right? So thinking about where else do disabled people live or access, and not just thinking about concentrated areas near hospitals or public transportation, but also thinking about city buildings and other places that we want to be able to access and go to that maybe the city had forgotten or wasn't on their radar in the same way.
Yeah, totally. And related to that, they also mentioned that they brought in folks from surrounding communities. Obviously, Rosemary is a resident of Wheat Ridge. Jonathan, even as biking around, we don't just stay in the city and county of Denver. We do need to travel to other areas as well. How do you see that playing out as well?
In terms of connecting to other communities?
Right, yeah.
Well, I think that Denver has really established itself as a regional leader. And so, I think there's some other cities in the area that like to think of themselves as at the forefront, but I really view what Denver has been doing lately as putting itself at the top of design in the Front Range. And so I think that as Denver starts to establish standards like this, it really spreads to the surrounding communities, and people want to be able to make those connections. And they look to people like David, who we'll hear from, to sort of point the path forward.
I would just add to, as someone who used to live in Denver, I no longer could afford living in Denver. And I know that's the same for a lot of folks in our community. So thinking about ways that we connect Aurora, and I know that we have the light rail, but it's not as many stops or as accessible for some folks, or even extending it out to Lakewood and Wheat Ridge, where folks can afford housing. It's just not in Denver anymore. So how do we bring folks in who might have jobs or community or a space where they feel safe, and still invite them in, instead of just saying that we want to focus on this bubble and then we'll pilot it out in larger cities.
Great. Yeah, and my colleague Mo from Bicycle Colorado is doing a great job in the chat of sharing resources of local advocacy groups here in Denver, and actually asking for recommendations as well. So we'll definitely be taking notes about that and see where we can move forward from here. So Rosemary, Jonathan, if you have any last comments before we move on to David's presentation.
Yeah, just to answer Mo's question. Also, thank you, Mo, for putting all of those resources in the chat. For those who don't live in Denver, I would say the best way to get connected to the disability community is through your local Center for Independent Living. And there are 9 across the state of Colorado, and they are run specifically by people with disabilities for people with disabilities. And they have consumers and clients that they work with every single day who have that lived experience. And the challenges that we have around transportation in Denver are going to look very different in Pueblo and very different in Durango, and even more different in Steamboat Springs, right? So getting connected to your local Center for Independent Living, I think, is a really great start.
And I would be remiss if I didn't drop a link for Denver Bicycle Lobby in the comments as well. But one last thing that I would like to touch on is just that bike lanes, had historically been viewed as able-bodied people on 2 wheels using the bike lanes. And I think that when you look to especially places like the Netherlands, you see that bike lanes are used by people of all abilities, and they really give people a lot of freedom. There are people on electric assisted tricycles, and there are cargo bikes that carry people in wheelchairs. And so bike lanes that can accommodate people, not just on normal bicycles, but of all abilities, is really crucial. And that involves designing wider bike lanes and designing bike lanes with healthy buffers to allow for passing so that people can ride at different speeds, and that the bike lane is now just sort of a mobility lane.
Great point. Lots of enthusiasm for that in the chat as well. So now I'd like to turn it over to David Pulsifer to share about, some current and planned protected bikeways in Denver.
All right, thanks, Jessica, and thanks everybody. My panelists before me all done a wonderful job, and excited just to talk a little bit about what Denver is doing related to the protected bike lanes, and also coming at the heel of the completion of our Complete Streets design guidelines, because there's some great complementary work going in there that is part of this whole conversation, is making streets work for everyone, not just a few. So next slide, please. So one of the things I kind of wanted to illustrate, and you'll have to kind of focus in on the top left corner of there, but what our Complete Streets design guidelines are doing is helping guide the private and public development of our streets, and designating space for people to use, and especially helping us guide this protected bike lane conversation. But just to kind of give you guys a little bit of background on the history of PBLs, as we sometimes call them, protected bike lanes in Denver. So the very first protected bike lane, actually this would be a good poll question. I wish I would have thought of this earlier, but who can guess for those of you familiar with Denver, the very first protected bike lane in Denver, and what year was it installed? Maybe you can put your guesses in the chat. Our very first protected bike lane was on 15th Street downtown, and it was installed in 2014. So it's kind of crazy to think that facility is now going on 7 years old. And there are some, that facility was installed before I came to the city, but there were definitely a lot of like learning that came with putting that facility, you know, as those of you familiar with downtown and familiar with 15th, that is also a very heavily used transit route. And it is also very busy with respects to business access and community access and frontages and driveways. So there's just a lot of issues going on with that one. What's kind of fun about 15th is that we actually, in I believe the tail end of 2019, we did a second iteration of 15th. So 15th 2.0, where we added additional vertical protection measures like a rubberized curb and different flex posts. And then we also installed corner turn islands and in flex post form. And if you look at the image on that I have shared here, you can kind of see those if you look into the crosswalk, you can see those things that look like a quarter of a pie. Those are what we call corner turn wedges, and those require vehicles turning to make a more, first of all, slow them down. It forces them to approach the intersection at a more direct angle, so that means it puts people using the crosswalk in a better perspective to be seen, and also helps remind motorists that they need to slow down when turning. So those were some of the first corner turn wedges in the city. And 15th is just a really great example of that the public right-of-way is not static, it's evolving, and that we can make improvements. And if something's not working, you know, we can try to make it better. So 15th was our first bike lane, our protected bike lane. And just last year, we completed sections of a couplet on 14th and 13th and 14th Avenue. And so total in Denver, we have about 15 bike lane miles of protected bike lanes. And we have an additional 73 miles of protected bike lanes identified in Denver Moves Bikes. The good news is right now, in terms of funding and building out that network, we have about 40 of that 73 miles still identified. We have about 40 miles of it funding identified. So we're going to see a really big expansion of our protected bike lane network here in Denver. And wanted to talk a little bit about some of the issues that and the challenges that we face related to ADA parking in relation to our protected bike lanes. So one of the issues that we have to address is, and you can kind of see on this graphic as well, is that we do like to make the parking stalls themselves longer in distance, so that way it gives people utilizing wheelchairs or other mobility assisted devices abilities to either enter through the side of their car or the rear of their vehicle. When you have the vehicles parked too close together, you're not giving adequate space for people to get in and out of their vehicle. So that's one issue that we address. Secondly, is allowing for adequate spacing, that was mentioned earlier, between the protective movements, the protective elements. So that's obviously easier with bollards that are easier to space. But in some areas, we do have concrete curbs which we'll be going to looking at an example later today of a vertical element, which is obviously provides a greater level of security and separation from vehicle traffic, but then presents a challenge in terms of adequate spacing and making sure that people can fit through there after they exit their vehicle. So as was mentioned by our friends in San Francisco, buffer width is something that we look at as well to provide comfortable loading access in between the bike lane and within the buffer and into our vehicle. And then also curb access. So something we also need to pay attention to is we want to minimize the amount of distance that someone would have to travel. And so typically when we would mark a parking space, understanding that people with mobility restrictions can use any space, but we also do have designated ADA parking. So when we do designate the ADA parking, we put that as close to the curb or as close to a curb ramp as possible, so that minimizes that distance in which they would have to travel. One of the challenges that we have in Denver right now is just the process in which we go to designate ADA parking. There is a whole program for that where citizens can request for ADA parking, and typically we would be alerted to that when we were doing a project on a street. If a space is already designated as an ADA space, then when we are resurfacing or redoing the street, that space would maintain and still be an ADA, and other obviously code enforcement and restrictions apply in terms of providing the adequate number. But if on a typical street, if there wasn't a spot that's specifically designated for ADA, then it wouldn't, when we redid the street, it wouldn't be upgraded or converted to an ADA designated space. So one challenge we have is making sure that the designs we have and that the designs are going in will accommodate ADA parking and parking movements and needs without actually having the space being designated as an ADA space. So that's just something that we constantly have to be aware of and work toward and make sure our design parameters accommodate that, even if it's not specifically designed. I did want to, Jack, if you go to the next slide, wanted to mention something that's exciting that's coming out of our design guidelines that also impact the ADA community and those with mobility restrictions or limitations is our shared streets. And shared streets are something that are going to be coming to Denver more and more frequently. What's really exciting about these is that they are designed to be very, very low volume streets with very slow speeds, less than 500 vehicles and a day, and very people going 10 miles per hour. And we already have an example of this up in North Denver on 39th Avenue. And many of these streets can be curbless, meaning you could just walk, bike, or roll from what would be designated as a sidewalk into the street. And we are also getting quite a bit of interest. And what's been important about these design guidelines is that our developer community are wanting to put these in new developments. And so needing some identified parameters on what is the appropriate design for a shared street so that people of all mobilities can feel comfortable and welcome in the street and on the sidewalk as well. So just wanted to mention that as well, because it does relate to our issue, our topic today that we're discussing, and something exciting that we're going to be seeing more of here in Denver. And that's all I have for my presentation, and happy to turn it over to you guys for questions and the rest of the program.
Yeah, absolutely. So as David mentioned, we'll be getting to a case study in just a minute, but we're going to take some time now to answer some of your questions. So this is kind of a combination of two questions that we received. Are there any environmental concerns with the green paint wearing away and making its way into waterways? And do Denver's guidelines even include green paint? If not, why not?
So typically where we do green paint is where there is known conflict areas between people on bikes and then people in cars. So typically intersections or approaching intersections. To be honest, I know it's the thermoplastic treatment that goes on the street, and I don't know the environmental impacts of that. I could, I'd have to do some Googling to find out. I know that we do have pretty stringent, EPA and environmental guidelines here. That's the whole reason why we don't use salting, and pre-treatment materials and stuff on cold, icy days. So I'm sure that whatever we do is compliant there, but I don't know the impacts.
Yeah, maybe our California contingent has some more info on that.
I also do not know environmental impacts, but we use thermoplastic paint as well for I would say the vast majority of our green painted bike lanes. We generally use the green paint along a block face, and then at conflict zones, let's say a mixing zone, that green paint might turn to like a broken green to kind of indicate that this is an area where there's going to be some mixing between cyclists and motorists. We've been moving away from the mixing zones, but we do have some. Then also at alleys, we might use a greenback sharrow, something like that, to add additional indication.
Okay. So it appears there's raised materials in the buffer. I'm assuming we're referring to the concrete buffers that David just shared. Does that interfere with van lifts at all?
So I guess, is that coming from the side of the van as opposed to the right? Is that what we're talking about, or the rear of the van?
Exactly.
Yeah, so that's where it goes back to like the spacing issue, and we do design that there to be gaps in that so that you could put one down. But that again that's something that I could see being overlooked from time to time. So it's important for us to to look and see how it's functioning, because I could see that if there would probably be a space or two where it wouldn't be a conflict, but some of the other spaces it would definitely I would be my guess that it would stop the ramp from going all the way down to the concrete or to the pavement because of the elevated surface of the bollard.
Yeah, so related to that, there are a lot of neighborhood bikeways in the works, David. So can you speak to how access for people with disabilities will be improved along these corridors? Now, these are not necessarily protected bike lanes, but
Sure. So I would say by and large, the environment for access won't change at all, but the environment in terms of like restricting how and where people park. But I will say that what the neighborhood bikeway will make it much more comfortable for people loading and getting in their car, because the volumes will be lower, the speeds will be slower. Everyone knows that feeling of worrying about opening their car door with a car going by really fast because there's not a lot of room, or just not having enough space, or worrying about where you put your stroller for your child darting out. And what neighborhood bikeways do is make those speeds slower. They prioritize people, and they also limit the amount of people actually using those streets. So overall, it's an improvement for everyone who lives on the street and uses it not as a cut through. Those are the only people it doesn't work better for, people who want to use neighborhood bikeways as a cut through to avoid some other high volume street.
great. So just taking a look at the time here, we do have quite a few questions in the chat now, and you can continue submitting those and we'll get them to the panelists and answered for you. But we're going to move on now to our case study. So just to make sure we have plenty of time to discuss with our panelists. So just a little bit of background. And actually, Jack, I think we should be back to the slides before we get to the activity. So the idea behind this case study is we just wanted to run through an example of how the guidelines should be applied or could be applied to an existing protected bike lane here in Denver. Perfect, thank you, Jack. So today we'll be looking at 14th Street, which is a one-way street in downtown Denver with about 2 to 3 travel lanes for vehicles at various points and a bike lane that is protected by raised concrete buffers, reflective plastic bollards, and parking. And we're going to be looking specifically at the block of 14th Street between Champa and Stout Streets, which is circled here in red. And this area, if you're from Denver, you know, is a popular entertainment destination as well as a busy bike commuter route. Nearby destinations or connections include the Theater District Convention Center Light Rail Station, the Denver Performing Art Complex, the Convention Center, the 16th Street Mall is just a couple blocks away, as well as plenty of shopping, restaurants, hotels, and offices. And also Bikeways connects to the Cherry Creek Trail nearby and various other bike lanes and bus routes on cross streets. So before we dive in, I wanted to provide a little background on the evolution of the 14th Street bike lane. Next slide, please. So on the left, you can see what the street looked like at our case study location before the bike lane was installed. That Google Street View image is from July 2008, which is shortly after voters approved a bond improvement package in 2007 that included funding for streetscape improvements on 14th Street. So in addition to expanded sidewalks, bench seating, and the planting of about 150 trees, the project also added a standard bike lane to 14th Street, taking over what was previously a travel lane for vehicles, which is what you can see on the right. The streetscape project itself was completed in 2011. That image is from April 2015. Next slide. So in 2017, the bike lane was actually upgraded to a protected bike lane, switching the parking and biking lanes and adding a raised concrete buffers to prevent drivers from parking in the bike lane. Mike kind of alluded to this earlier. A common problem with these bike lanes is encroachment by vehicles. And that was definitely true for 14th Street. So as you can see from the Streets blog screenshot, it was positively received by people who regularly bike along the corridor. So Streets blog Denver praised what was then the first protected bike lane of its kind in Denver. And so the image on the right shows what the street looks like today. So Jack, now we can switch to the Jamboard. Our colleague will be taking notes. And so we're going to take a closer look at this specific location, what the bike lane looks like now at this particular block. And so this is basically photos of half the bike lane near Champa and the other half near Stout. So the full block. So I'd like to open it up to our panelists and to our audience. Feel free to comment in the chat. What potential conflicts do you see here with this latest design between cyclists and people with disabilities?
I guess I can go first. So the buffer is a little narrow. I mean, this used to be on my commute, so I used to ride this every day. So I was familiar with it, or I guess still am, even though I haven't commuted in about a year. Yeah, so the buffer is a little narrow, and it's, I mean, the aspect of people getting out of their cars and moving is one thing, but there's still a small chance of getting doored. So I was almost doored in this bike lane because the buffer is too narrow. But then as the Walk SF guide shows, in terms of people needing space to, once they've gotten out of the car, to get to the curb, the bike lane isn't necessarily wide enough to allow them to just use the bike lane, and the buffer certainly isn't wide enough, I guess, unless they straddled the concrete curbs, which obviously isn't viable. So you know, there's a width constraint here that is really the primary problem.
This is Rosemary. I think the first thing that stands out is something that Jamie had mentioned in the chat or the Q&A. For folks who have vans with wheelchair lifts or even paratransit, it would be really hard to get my wheelchair out of my vehicle and have enough space to then safely get out of my vehicle. Then that's not what the bike lane is for, right? Like, I can't be midway down on the lift and then a bike comes by. Like, that's not the purpose. So making sure that there's enough buffer. And I see on the second picture that there are the taller pillars, which would make more sense because then you don't have the concrete to contend with, and you would have enough space not just for a van, but for a walker or a stroller or lots of other configurations that would be safer for folks. And also thinking about snow removal. And I saw that someone else brought that up, and I know that San Francisco luckily doesn't have to worry about snow, but we do here. And that's a really big barrier outside of not being able to get on the sidewalk. Is just, you know, sometimes snow, even 2 or 3 inches, could be the same barrier as a curb or a sidewalk that doesn't have any access. So those are just a few things that pop up for me.
This is Jody, and I'd like to add to Jonathan's challenges to the buffer. What we noticed when we did take people who use wheelchairs out to experience the bike lanes, that buffer was used for to get to actually a curb cut. And so with concrete barriers in that buffer, the people in wheelchairs would have to be weaving in and out of the bike lane, which causes for added danger zones, and what we really want to try to avoid.
This is Mike. I can give a from San Francisco when we considered using a similar kind of concrete curb. We were considering a more temporary kind of a wheel stop treatment on a street that at the time did not have a raised sidewalk. So what would be the sidewalk was effectively a shared bike ped space with adjacent parking. And we were considering using wheel stops as a way to make sure that motorists didn't park and drive in the pedestrian and cyclist space. We decided against that after going on a site visit with advocates, people that actually, you know, are out there using this infrastructure every day. One of the concerns that we heard were for people with low vision that use canes for walking, that these curbs can pose tripping hazards. Never mind getting in and out of the car, but just walking along, that they can be a tripping hazard. So we decided to use kind of what you see at 14th and Stout by using a delineator kind of at the front and rear of each parking stall. And using that, and evaluating, we found that treatment resulted in motorists not driving into and parking in that shared space.
This is Jill. I'm acting as a proxy for the audience. We got a bunch of comments coming in through the chat, and one thing that people have pointed out is that there is no curb cut access except for at the corners. So accessing the curb mid-block is challenging, and also creates the opportunity for two-way traffic. If somebody in a wheelchair is trying to get to the closest curb cut, they may be going against the bike lane traffic.
Yeah, another thing I noticed, someone brought it up in the chat too, is the scooters on the sidewalk there, you know, could prevent just access to either the parking meter or just really getting to the larger part of the sidewalk, in addition to the poles that Rosemary pointed out. So I think micromobility, as that comes back to Denver, parking for those smaller vehicles will also be something to consider, I think, in these designs. Any final thoughts on this particular, any potential conflicts, any type of conflict you see here?
Another comment from the chat is the bike lane may not be that visible to pedestrians who might step out into it and not realize that they're stepping into a bike lane. So is there some way to make the bike lane itself more visible and obvious to people?
Totally. So Jack, I think we can move on to the second slide here. Looking at same pictures, but just considering potential solutions that could mitigate the conflicts we just outlined. And how can we apply the San Francisco guidelines to this particular bike lane? And it looks like we even have some comments from the audience here of, you know, potential solutions as well.
This is Rosemary. I mean, I would love to see a mid-block curb cut so that you could access from either side and not have to, like, if I was hypothetically driving, you know, one of the cars parked in the middle, I would have to then navigate either up the street or down the street. And that, I think, defeats the purpose and the safety. I also think making it a different color that makes it stand out so that pedestrians can recognize, or I know other people had mentioned that, you know, the convention center, people in that area use it for loading or unloading, and that's not the purpose either. So just making it really clear what the intent is of that buffer space in the bike lane.
I think Rosemary makes a great point about the unloading and loading. Just from using context clues, it looks like there's a lot of activity here, and I see a lot of parked cars. So I wonder if, you know, real estate is at a minimum in the right of way. If we can couple some kind of mid-block loading area with the loading zone, especially a passenger loading zone that has a more generous adjacent buffer. We've known just from evaluation that, you know, loading zones, passenger loading zones, commercial loading zones are used by a variety of people, and you get more curb usage, more turn from a loading zone. So I think that an ADA compliant loading zone would be great at a location like this that has lots of loading needs.
We have a question in the audience. How does mid-block curb cut impact visually impaired folks? Is there any possibility that they might be confused and think that that's a safe place to actually cross the street as opposed to accessing the loading zone? I'm wondering how you've dealt with that in San Francisco.
That's an excellent question. Generally, we have on a street that would have a protected bike lane, so a street with higher vehicle volumes, we tend to not have uncontrolled mid-block pedestrian crossings. So I think there'll be some other context clues for that traveler outside of just the curb ramp. But that's something that I have not personally heard of confusion about that, and that might be a part of the reason why. But it's an excellent question.
This is Rosemary. I think in my experience, at least with the community, there are specific shapes of the yellow truncated domes, and they indicate different things for folks who use canes. So some of them are lines, some of them are dots, and each of them means something different. So when they're placed strategically, the folks who use canes know whether it is an actual crossing to cross the street or if it is a curb cut to enter. It will indicate that you are leaving a safe sidewalk, entering into a different zone, but that it's not a crossing zone. So it could be something as simple as the type of truncated domes that you're using. Now, if you're a wheelchair user or if you've ever used any of those scooters in those pictures, you know that truncated domes are really challenging if you're on wheels. So it's just another potential conflicting access need that could come up. But I think it's also how you communicate with the community and how involved you have the community in that process to get that feedback of how can we indicate that this is not a safe crossing, but it is a mid-block crossing instead.
Could we take a look at the last
Related-
slide as
Oh,
well
go ahead.
at some point to go over a little sketch?
We will. Yeah, and just before we get there, we actually have another slide right after this that just provides a little more context to the larger area. So Mike, you noted that this is a busy area. It is adjacent to a light rail station. So the intersection at 14th and Stout, you can see those light rail tracks crossing. You can see those truncated domes that Rosemary just mentioned. And then on sort of the north side of the bike lane at 14th and Champa, you see a more traditional intersection. So there are a couple different, sort of design differences here. Kind of the same questions here. What challenges do we see? What potential solutions do we see here?
I think there's a couple of issues with the intersections. One is that it's the intersection of two one-ways. So there's only two turning movements, but all of the corners are designed the same. So they all have large curb radii, and there's a really easy opportunity to essentially narrow the intersection at the corners where there is no turning movement to make the crossing distance shorter for people crossing the street. That'll be a little bit more easily seen potentially in the other sketch. But there's just a lot of real estate that's given over to cars right now that doesn't need to be. It's not serving any purpose because people aren't turning there.
This is Rosemary. As someone who used the light rail to get downtown in these exact spaces, getting off at the convention district, theater district area, this crosswalk specifically is really challenging because it's not just a crosswalk, it's also including train tracks for the light rail. And so as a person who uses a wheelchair or uses a cane for mobility, it gets really complex. And so I know that we have the truncated domes, but thinking about ways that we can make it a little bit more clear, because I've had cars or people or, a lot of confusion around which way to go and which way is safe, and trying to figure out when the light rail is coming or when it's not coming and when it's safe to cross. So I think that would be a really great addition, is just some clear, whether that's paint or signs or something else. I think that would be really helpful.
Great. So then on the very last slide, Jonathan provided us with some ideas of how we can upgrade the bike lane and the whole street even further. So Jonathan, you want to explain a little bit more about what you're showing here?
Sure. So if you look at the DRCOG traffic counts for the area, the most recent data shows only 6,000 cars a day going through there. So we currently dedicate of a 45-foot curb to curb width, 38 feet is dedicated to cars. So in the sketch that I put together, rather than two travel lanes, there's just one. And I removed there's a turn lane at Stout, right by the train tracks as well. So I removed that as well. And the result is that there's currently 14 parking spots. You get 20 parking spots and 2 loading zones in front of the residential building across the street. And then you also get an 8-foot wide buffer next to the parking adjacent to the bike lane, and the bike lane is 12 feet wide. So the bike lane now is a bike lane that's a width that can be used by all sorts of people riding all sorts of vehicles, room to pass, and there's room in the buffer for people to move parallel to the curb within the buffer in order to access, whether it's a mid-block curb ramp or to the end. There's opportunities to introduce green infrastructure potentially in the buffer in some areas. And you have a bike lane that's wide enough also to clear snow with normal snow clearing equipment as opposed to specialized bike lane clearing equipment, which I know we have some, but it's in limited supply. So it's a bike lane that's really of sort of international standards in terms of its width and comfort. And it also provides really nice access to the curb for people who arrive there and need that.
Great. So getting some love for this design in the chat. Do our panelists have any initial reactions to this?
Yeah, Jonathan, I'll say, so, I mean, it's interesting. I guess everything's all, it's all relative. Like, when you say like only 6,000 for us, 6,000 is really high, So, I mean, that part of the, reason why we justify the protected bike lane is because 6,000 is a lot. So, but other than that, I mean, I'm always up for, making streets work better for people walking and biking and moving and taking transit. And this is just kind of one of our unsung heroes of downtown Denver. And I think it gets kind of often neglected, but when you think about like its connectivity to transit, and then someone had a really good point in the chat mentioning just because of its proximity to the convention center and the performing arts complex, that it's a lot of tourists and people in Denver maybe for the first time in their life. So all of this happening at the same time, it can be a very confusing environment. So whatever we do just to make it common sense is probably going to be beneficial. I also know that we just completed a study in front of a mobility study related to the performing arts complex, and they're doing some work on it that will actually help with some of the conflicts we were having with loading, but then also kind of adding some additional security measures or security in terms of vehicle security, not being able to cross over the buffers and things like that. But I like what you've done.
Absolutely. And thank you so much. And so unfortunately, that's all the time we have left in our session this morning. So I'd like to give a huge thanks to our panelists for your time and your thoughts this morning, as well as for all the important work you're doing to ensure people have greater freedom to travel and thrive, regardless of their ability. And thank you to all of the attendees for joining us to listen and learn and engaging with us and others in the chat. So I think we have just a couple more slides. We'll have these slides up available for you to take a look at. And we're also excited to bring our members and supporters to amazing opportunities to take home a new bike in 2021. You can win an Atlas Carbon road bike donated by our friends at Alchemy Bicycles, or an Electra Townie 7D donated by the good folks at Campus Cycles. These raffles run through March 1st at 5 p.m. and you can get your tickets at that link, bit.ly/raffle221. And so thank you again, everyone, for joining us. And we hope to see you back for our next session on Thursday morning at 9 a.m. Undoing Systemic Racism Through Equitable Planning. Thanks and have a great day.